welcome back once again to freephotoshop.com and video number 23 on this epic journey through the world of image editing using the one and only levels command. In the previous few videos we've been focusing on histograms. We've taken a look at the RGB, the luminance and the colour histograms, so you should have a good knowledge base on how those histograms are calculated and presented here inside Photoshop. And if you were with me during those tutorials, then you'll know that it's not ever going to be about which histogram stands out from the crowd. It's more about where their respective strengths and weaknesses lie, and knowing that all three will tell a different story. Now, all through this series we've been working inside the RGB colour mode, and that's no mistake. RGB is the standard for the vast majority of Photoshop users. From what we've already talked about, we know that when we change a luminance level inside an RGB image using a command like levels, for example, we automatically shift not only the brightness of the pixels, but the colours as well. On many occasions that's a great way to work, there's nothing wrong with it, and you can achieve everything you want to by doing it this way. However, and there's always a but in these situations, you'll remember when we looked at the luminance histogram a few videos ago, it was able to give us an accurate idea of where in the image we were clipping highlights and shadows, and where luminance levels were in the image independent of any colour information, which was a great thing because we could really avoid clipping shadows and clipping highlights inside the images that we were working on. The only drawback was that we didn't have any direct control over those luminance levels because we weren't able to edit them independent of the standard RGB histogram. In other words, the luminance histogram isn't available inside the levels command. Well, just imagine first of all if there was some way of splitting luminance and colour information here inside of Photoshop, and second of all being able to edit it directly inside levels. Well, it turns out that both of these are possible, and I'm going to show you how to do it and why you'd want to do it inside this video. So first of all, let me introduce you to the photograph that I've got loaded onto screen here called Clouds Over the Chrysler. A photograph, of course, of the world famous Chrysler building in New York City. And by the way, before we open levels, I'm going to hit Ctrl-K, Ctrl-4 to open up the performance section of the preferences dialog box here inside of Photoshop. That's Command-K, Command-4 if you're following along on the Mac. And I wanted to do this just so I can show you that I've reset the cache levels here to 6. And you'll remember in the previous video we changed this setting to just 1. Well, now if you're following along with me, I'd advise you to switch this back to 6, which I believe is the default here inside of Photoshop. Now I'm going to OK my way out of here to get back to the image that we were working on, or about to work on I should say. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start off by showing you how to split luminance and colour inside Photoshop Elements. And this is also a good technique to use on occasions inside the full version of Photoshop. But for Elements users this is going to be the only way to go. I'm going to hit Ctrl or Command L to open up the new Levels Adjustment Layer dialog box. And I'm going to call this Luminance, like so. Now I'm going to come down here to the Mode option and change things from Normal to the Luminance Blending mode, which means that any changes we make here inside Levels will only modify the luminance levels of each pixel inside the image. So we're going to get no colour shifts whatsoever. We're not even going to get to shift any saturation inside the image. We're only going to make pixels lighter or darker inside this photograph. So if I go ahead and hit the OK button, I'm going to open up the Levels dialog box, and I can now shift this composite midtone slider around to make the pixels that fall into the midtone region of the photograph either lighter or darker. And you can see on screen here now that we're not shifting any colours inside the image whatsoever. In fact, if I switch over here to say the blue channel and play around with the midtones now, I'm actually editing the luminance levels inside the blue channel, not colour inside the blue channel. You've probably also noticed that we don't see that luminance histogram anywhere, and unfortunately we won't. Here inside the RGB mode it's impossible to make direct modifications to a luminance histogram. Okay, I'm going to cancel out of here. What if we want to make changes to the colours but not the luminance data, I hear you ask? as in this image here, I'd say that the luminance levels of the image are just about right. They're just about where we want them to be. So what if we want to just change the colours inside the photograph independent of the luminance data? Well, we'd hit Control or Command L again. We'd name the adjustment layer Colour. Always a good habit to get into, naming layers is. We'd come down here to the Mode option once again, and this time we get a couple of options depending on what we want to do. We have the Hue mode, which will allow us to amend just the colour information inside the image independent of the saturation or luminance values. We also get the Saturation mode that's going to permit us to adjust the saturation of the image independent of the hues and also luminance. There's also the Colour mode, which is the one I'm going to select actually just to give you a taste of how it works here. And the Colour mode allows us to amend the hue and saturation of an image without making any changes to the luminance. So I'll make sure that Colour is the active mode and then hit OK. Now I'm going to make a few creative changes to this image. So I'll switch to the blue channel and I'm going to change the midtone slider to a value of 0.10 to shift those midtones into the yellow range of that colour wheel we were looking at a few videos back. What we've actually done here is subtracted blue, just in case you're interested. Next I'll switch to the green channel and I'm going to subtract some green from here. So I'll change that midtone value to 0.5, just like so. And I think that's looking pretty interesting. It certainly gives a good demo as to what we can achieve by making changes in the colour mode and keeping those luminance levels as they were originally. To accept the changes, I'm going to hit OK, and we get to see the entire image along with the effects we've added. And you know, I quite like what we've done here with this photograph. We've got some really powerful colours going on inside the Chrysler building, and the sky looks pretty mysterious and fitting for the scene actually. Now, just to understand what was going on there, I'm going to switch to this colour wheel image that we saw in video number 18 of this series. And I'll just run you through what happened so it all makes sense. We started off by subtracting blue from the blue channel. That meant we were introducing more of the blue's complementary colour to the image, which of course is yellow over the other side of the colour wheel here. We then subtracted some green from the green channel, which of course added more of its complementary colour, which is magenta. So if that's the case, then we'd expect the image to have a lot of red in it, seeing as adding magenta and yellow together gives us red. The reason the image ended up looking more of a golden colour is because if you want to check those mid-tone sliders, we actually subtracted a lot more blue than we did green. So we're adding a lot more yellow into the mix than we are magenta, and that's swaying the colour more towards yellow. Hence we're ending up with a colour that's a lot closer to, say, this region right about here. Okay, I'm going to switch back to the photograph and then hit the F12 key on the keyboard to revert the image back to its last saved state. And seeing as we've not saved this image yet, we're going to get a revert all the way back to the original image, which is just what we want. Okay, things are looking very blue all of a sudden, but that's okay because we're now going to take our first look at the world of lab or LAB colour. Unfortunately, at time of recording this tutorial, Photoshop Elements doesn't support what I'm about to do. But if you're working in the full version of Photoshop, then I'd like you to come up here to the image menu, select mode, and then we've got a couple of familiar colour modes lined up here, namely RGB, which is the active one, and CMYK, which we've discussed earlier on in this free Photoshop.com series. The one we're interested in here though is the lab colour space. So let's go ahead and click it to convert all the pixels in this photograph from RGB values to lab values, and that's not going to result in any change on screen. The lab colour space is actually a lot wider than the RGB space, so every colour we had access to inside of RGB is available to us right here inside of lab. So in other words, we get a lossless conversion from RGB to lab, which is always a good thing. Now very briefly, just in case you're wondering what we're doing here, lab colour is often the colour space of choice for a lot of high-end users out there. There's a lot of professionals that use lab for their work because it's such a large colour gamut. There's colours inside lab that your monitor can't display, and that's just an example of how wide this space is. And just like when we discuss the 16-bit mode actually, that's going to give us a lot more room to get things right. Lab is also device independent, and what I mean by that is pretty much all the other colour modes, like RGB for example, have various versions of RGB to determine. Say for example what red is. So if you're working with RGB, then you need to know which version you're working with. Standard RGB, Adobe RGB, to name just a few. These different versions are what we would refer to as profiles. So if someone asks you what profile of RGB you're working with, then that's what they mean. Lab, on the other hand, only has one absolute version. So if you send someone your lab images, then they'll be able to view or print them exactly as you've intended. Although to make things even more complicated, that's going to depend on the calibration of both the printer and the monitor. Anyhow, this is a really large subject, so I'll try and keep just to the basics here. But another great reason why a lot of people like Lab is because it separates luminance information from colour information as standard. To see how that works, I'm going to tab back the palettes and just make sure that we can see the channels palette down here. And you'll see what I'm referring to. We have what looks like 4 channels, but it's actually 3. The top one here is just a composite view of the other 3 channels added together, similar to what we get inside the RGB and CMYK colour modes. So first of all, we have a lightness channel, which if I click is going to show us just the luminance information inside this photograph. So this channel represents no colour data whatsoever. All we have here is information about brightness or the luminance of the photograph. The next 2 channels contain all the colour information inside the image, and if you imagine them being based on an axis with A going one way and then B running perpendicular to it, the A channel contains all the magentas through to the greens, and the B channel contains all the yellows through to the blues. So I'll go ahead and activate the luminance channel, and then I'll click the eyeball of the A channel to reveal the magentas and greens that make up the photograph. And you can see that there's not many going on here at all. If I switch off the A channel though and then switch on the B channel, this time we get a lot more information because the image is made from a larger degree of blues and yellows than it was from magentas and greens. Okay, I'm going to switch to the composite view once again, and then I'll hit Control or Command L on the keyboard to open up levels. And once again I'm going to call this colour because that's where we're going to be heading with this image. Then I'll hit OK to enter the levels dialog box. Now if we check out the channels here inside levels, you'll notice first of all we don't get a composite. We're going straight into that luminance histogram that's going to be exactly the same as the one we saw whilst in the RGB mode. In fact, the luminance histogram we saw in RGB was a direct relation to this one right here. The only difference is now we have the power to edit it. So just like before, I'll move this midtone slider around to see the image getting lighter and darker without affecting the colours in the photograph one bit. Next I'll switch over to the A channel and look at that colour information that came from the RGB colour space. See how small it looks in comparison to the wider colour space we now have access to inside the lab colour mode. So just to bring them in just a touch, I'm going to take the black point up to 50 and then the white point down to 205, just so we're moving 50 levels in each direction. Now I'll switch to the B channel, and here remember we have most of the colour that's contained within the photograph. So I'll start by moving both the black and white points in by 50 levels, so we're reading 50 and 205 respectively. Now I'm going to go a little crazy with these colours. So I'll move the white slider in towards the start of this little tail here, until we get somewhere like 160. Now just to soften the effects and return those midtones to a better place, I'm going to move the midtone slider back in towards the middle of this batch of colours we have here, just looking at the image as we go, and right about here a value of, what's this, 0.80, I'd say that's just about perfect. Now if we wanted to take some of that redness out, we could switch back to the A channel and then just grab control of this midtone slider and move it back slightly to a lower gamma value to get things looking the way we like it. I don't want to take too much out though. I think a value of something like 0.97 is enough. I quite like what the reds are offering us here. In fact, I'm quite happy to call this the final result. I'll hit OK to accept the changes, And as I say, lots and lots of things going on here inside the lab colour mode. It's really a great colour space to work in, as you can see from the amendments that we've applied to this image. Now we can go ahead and save the image out. And if we want to do that, however, we're going to limit the choice of file formats that we can use. We'd have to go with something like a TIFF format or the old PSD extension. Either way is fine. If you want to save it as a JPEG though, so you can email the image to someone else to view, for example, then you're going to need to switch back to the RGB colour mode, as a lot of formats like JPEG don't support the lab colour mode. So with that in mind, I'm going to come back up here to the image menu, select mode, and then switch things back to RGB colour. And unfortunately we can't bring our adjustment layer with us, so we either have to just discard it by clicking OK, or flatten the contents of the adjustment layer into the image by selecting the flatten option, which is what I'm going to go for here. Now I'll tab away the palette so we can focus on this finished image here, complete with rich, vivid colours and the perfect amount of luminance data, all thanks to being able to split luminance information from colour information right here inside of Adobe Photoshop. In the next video we're going to turn our attention to removing a colour cast from an image, both automatically and manually using the levels command. Thanks as always for joining me here at freephotoshop.com, and I'll see you in the next video.